Once upon a time, the woman was also considered just two-thirds of a human being. Not really a human being, but just two-thirds. We think that back then, slaves were considered, once upon a time, just property that could simply be abused, that could simply be up or be used depending on the people's whims. We think it is when we saw the harms that actually happened to these women, as well as to these slaves, that we eventually realized that these people, because they have human qualities, because we see that they have that mere capacity to feel pain, as well as even to recognize themselves or to be aware of themselves, we think we eventually granted them rights that they well deserved. It's the same thing with primates as well as dolphins now. We recognize that yes, we acknowledge that science might not be as solid as they might like it to be, but we think that the mere fact that we recognize human qualities, the mere fact that we recognize that capacity even to just feel pain or to even be aware of themselves or to see themselves in front of a mirror, we think that that alone warrants the fact that they are like human beings, and therefore they should this warrants also rights to a certain extent that will protect them, especially when they're vulnerable in society. We think because we as human beings have the capacity to go beyond the self, that we have this ability, that we have the mere capacity to also look after others. We think that it is for that reason we stand by government side. For 5 rebuttals I have for you today before I move to my 2 cases. First, they talk about this entire idea of the Good Samaritan law, right? Or that moral obligation which we cannot expect out of human beings. We think in the very first place that it's not a universal law to begin with, that you don't intervene, for example, when someone's being held at gunpoint. Instead, you call 911 and ask people who are more capable of actually saving these very animals, or the person who's in danger. We think that even if then, we think that it is a moral obligation that we're willing to impose on human beings, particularly because when we talk about the people who do harm these animals, particularly primates as well as dolphins, we think they've crossed that threshold of cruelty, and that's precisely why we have to do something now. No, thank you. Second rebuttal, this entire idea of how we cannot bind anyone and therefore animal welfare is enough. We think that in the very first place that you cannot simply rely on people's whims at the end of the day. In the same way that we had black activists for the black people's rights or women's rights as well, and how these eventually were institutionalized because we recognize the need and the value in society. We think it is when that happened that we are able to afford them rights, that we are able to champion humanity. That's precisely why we favor institutionalizing these particular rights and not just leaving it up to animal welfare or the arbitrary things that we have in status quo. Third, this entire idea of sentience, right? Because they attacked it. We think that we acknowledge we can never really penetrate the mind of a dolphin or the mind of a primate. But we think that when it comes to sentience, it's simply that ability to see the cry of a baby in the same way that we see the cry of a primate, or when a dolphin is squirming because you're hurting it. We think those are the kinds of things that we recognize simply because we are human beings as well. And that's why when it comes to this, we usually err on the side of caution, and that's why we would rather afford these people rights and make it clear that we do not accept it, instead of just saying, well, it's up to you, we don't think the baby is crying or is in pain, and therefore we won't go on. It's the same thing with primates and dolphins. Fourth, this entire idea of how it's arbitrary and how therefore it's unjust. We think rights are arbitrary in the first place anyway. We think when it comes to granting rights to why we grant rights to people under comatose, or we grant rights to babies, or even why we granted rights to women as well as slaves, it was always very arbitrary, but these actually reflected that human capacity to eventually expand and include other people because we recognize that there was a harm and that they are vulnerable. Lastly, on this idea of mobility, and he said, well, there's a problem now because now primates or dolphins will abuse their rights. We think number one, obviously, they're not going to flood a city in the same way that we saw in Planet of the Apes. We think that private property will still exist, that gorillas, for one, don't even live within the cities, but live in jungles to begin with, so that already there, the even proximity or the harms that they were talking about are quite ridiculous if you think about it. So at the end of the day, the entire harm that they're trying to blow up simply falls. But yes.
A hungry African farmer kills a baboon to feed his family. Would you give him the death penalty as required by the society?
Okay, well, obviously not to begin with, but we think that that's precisely the reason why we have to be able to draw the line when that happens. right? We think that when it comes to a moral obligation, or when it comes to just killing that baboon, even if there is a harm, we think that's particularly dangerous, especially when you cross that threshold of cruelty, especially when it comes to primates as well as dolphins. We think that when it comes to other animals, we're fine with that, but when it comes to these animals that are already at the next level of human beings, we are moving up to human beings, we think that's particularly harmful. That's what I'll explain in my argument for you today of how we create a more humane society. Because we recognize the three kinds of people right now, right? The people who will care, the people who won't care, and there are the people who will continue to hurt animals, and they are the problematic party, particularly because they do it simply because they want to. They do it because they're cruel, even when they see the pain of these animals already, the screeching monkeys or baboons or the dolphins. We think that it's particularly harmful that even when they see that pain, they continue to do it anyway. They continue to carry out their action. And that simply reflects a kind of desensitization to that ability, or to the recognition of pain, or that ability of another being to feel pain, and you disregard that anyway and kill it anyway. We think that is when the threshold is crossed, right? And the problem with that is now you're more likely to actually do the same to human beings, or to the next level as well. If you're capable of carrying out cruelty at this particular level, when you have primates and dolphins who are so close to that threshold already, we think it simply shows that you're capable of showing no care to species as well. And so it's precisely why you need to address these people, right? But what's the benefit of addressing these people who are particularly cruel, especially to primates as well as to dolphins? We think, number one, you reduce cruelty within society in general because you raise the bar of what it means to be humane, and we think that alone is already a value. But secondly, you also increase the very sensitivity we have for individuals or beings in general. And we think that that's very important, especially when we've seen the trends with women or with slaves, of how giving them or affording them rights has eventually helped us maximize their potential as well. How you create a better society in general by recognizing that a lot of other people deserve the same kind of humanity that we afford to human beings, or to men, in the same way that we saw what happened with women. But lastly, and this idea of how you create a more consistent moral stance then. The role of the government here is particularly important in drawing the line when it comes to arbitrary things. We think that the government has always been there to, one, make society internalize particular values, especially when we see society is unable to see the actual costs of their actions, especially when it comes to vulnerable parties in the debate. But secondly, it's always been there to preempt as well. When it comes to employing policies, when it comes to creating a common ground within society, we think that when it comes to women and slaves who were treated like objects before, in the same way that primates and dolphins are being treated as objects as well, we think that's something we have to consider. So all in all, what happens is you create a greater impetus now for people in general to act towards this particular harm, and that's why we stand with government.